Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Sales Academic Chronicles, hosted here at the Center for Professional Selling at Ball State University. I'm the host, Deva Rangarajan, and the director of the Sales Center here. Today, we have another interesting speaker. We have Professor Bryan Hochstein, who also happens to be my co-author on different projects. But more importantly, I'm here to talk about one of his papers that really caught my attention. And the title of the paper is called Adapting Influence Approaches to Informed Consumers in High Involvement Purchases. Are salespeople really doomed? So you can easily imagine that as soon as I saw this title, irrespective of the fact that I knew Bryan, that I was like, oh my God, are salespeople doomed? So it caught my attention. I had a chance to take a look at it. And then I thought, why not talk to Bryan about what was the motivation for this paper? What are the key findings? So once again, I look forward to this conversation. Once again, Professor Hochstein, Bryan, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Great to be here, Deva. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah. So Bryan, so tell me about the genesis of this paper. How did it all start? I know that it's part of your dissertation, right?
Yeah. So I was at Florida State as a doctoral student, 2012 to 16. When I got there, I had a 20-year career in B2B selling and some in B2C as well, my early career. And you try and find a topic, and the topic we came up with was this idea of customers or consumers having more information, and how does that affect, the internet and everything was still relatively new in 2013. I mean, it was still kind of just really starting to really impact business. And how does that affect salespeople? And if customers can get all the information they need, our salespeople needed. That was kind of a big topic for a while. There were people predicting that by the year 2020 that 1 million sales jobs would be eliminated. And honestly, we're going to be in the year 2020 here really soon, and I don't think that's happened. But it was a hot topic at the time. There's a book by Daniel Pink that talked about, to sell is human, and a lot of people just talking about how sales is changing and how it isn't going to be the same kind of role in the past. I do believe that that's happening, but the topic came from this idea that, hey, what if my paper's about business to consumer stuff, but it fits with business to business too? What if people can get all the information they need? What's the role of the salesperson then? And it's a compelling topic.
I really think so, because what really caught my attention was around the same time at my career, I had the privilege of working with a doctoral student, and it was not necessarily the same topic, but the genesis, the idea for that was the whole aspect of solution selling dead. The paper by Gartner, but CEB, which said that 57% of a buying decision is made because B2B customers are engaging themselves. But the premise is more or less the same, right? That your customers are more informed than before. You chose to focus on consumers. They talk about customers, but at the end of the day, technology is a common medium here, which makes it easier for people to get access to information.
Right. So, I mean, I always would show the kind of the upside down triangle of the buying process, which could be for consumers or somewhat similar for B2B, but that you start with identifying a need, and then you go through this external search, and you go through all these different steps. And early on in that, if you think about upside down triangle, the external search part used to be, or maybe it's inverted triangle, whatever it is. The external search was a big part of it, but that would include the salesperson. And really what we were finding, and what that study you said, 57%, I had one that says 70% at the time. A lot of people, or a lot of business buyers, would get to the point where they didn't even talk to a salesperson until they already had made they'd gone all the way through the process. They literally just at purchase. But then and that's good. I mean, that's an interesting thing. But what if they're wrong? I mean, that was kind of my question. Like, well, how does a salesperson, and that's still a topic I study now, is what if they're wrong? What if they think they know what's right, but there's some new options, or there's information they don't have, or there's always going to be changing stuff, and it seems that pace is accelerating. So that's where I think salespeople actually have some value. But then even if the salesperson knows that if the customer is not open to listening anymore, because they've already made their decisions, what do salespeople do about it there? So
that's for me, that was so essentially what happened is I started looking into what you were looking at, and I really like the fact that you mentioned I think it was the Forrester report, right, saying that 1 million jobs are going to be redundant, but we run sales centers, you have your own sales center, and never has been the demand for sales recruits been so high, with some of our students getting 2 to 3 jobs. So
I think what we've actually in practice found is that Well, and as you and I know, there's
Mm.
some other changes in this industry too, where the sales job is actually
Yeah,
becoming so complex. But what we found is that, yeah, in a vacuum, having more information does allow the consumer to, this isn't what my research says, but what I've
mm,
just found is that in a vacuum, if the only thing you had to do was make a decision on one item,
yeah,
yeah, having access to all the information, you could probably do it without a salesperson. You could figure it out. But the reality is buyers are buying multiple, if not hundreds of
yeah,
multiples of things. There's bounded rationality of people. We only are going to invest so much time and energy and effort into these things, and
absolutely.
we're never going to know. I mean, for some products we can. Some things we're really interested in, or they're key components of what we're doing. They're very critical to our operations. We might know a lot about those,
Yeah,
but for the vast majority of things that people buy in firms or that consumers buy, they're not going to be, they might think they're informed, but they might be misinformed, or they might know a lot and they might be able to do it, but consistently across time, the more information has just made the world more complex, and there's a bigger need than ever for salespeople that actually know more about this stuff and are kind of an authority on the subject. So
indeed,
I agree, it's stronger than ever. We do see that the sales function is changing a little bit because you need people more dedicated to this kind of knowledge task, and that's hard for pure salespeople to be dedicated to that and selling and prospecting and doing everything else. So we're seeing some changes there, but in general, the idea that somebody in the sales process has to be more knowledgeable than the consumer, that holds.
indeed.
And my research talks about how they go about influencing those
Indeed,
people that are
indeed,
informed.
and I want to get to that because before we get into the actual exact research, because for me topic is so interesting just by the fact that this triggers so many questions. And what I really like about it is that you could always make a claim that, you know what, that if you have these kind of customers have access to this information, and then you still need salespeople, you'll not need salespeople. But what I like about your research is you looked at high involvement purchases, which means that the customers are paying attention. You see
Yeah.
what I mean? That's what it is. You could always say, make a claim for the fact that, okay, there's a difference between people who are involved, that is, it's something that is important to them, and so they have to pay more attention to it. But that's what I like in the fact that even your research, my understanding is that for customers who are also involved, they might still need the help of salespeople as well, right? Am I correct in understanding that?
Yeah, so they're high involvement purchases, and I'll just be honest with you about why we looked at that and why we looked at consumer.
Mm,
Um, well, A, it was interesting, the idea of consumers, and there's a lot
mm,
more consumer buyers. But
yeah,
B was, I had a couple of companies that were interested to work on this topic,
mm,
and we were able to get some data, so that helped.
yeah,
Um, but then we thought, well, for these low involvement things,
yeah,
purchases you buy every day, things you buy
indeed.
on Amazon, you might get slightly informed, you might read some reviews, but you're going to make a decision. There's not a lot of risk in
Yeah,
them. If you make a wrong choice, big deal. But in the
absolutely.
more high end things where there is more risk, there's a lot more money, there's things that you can't return. Um, and we also thought it kind of was closer to the kind of decisions that business buyers would buy as well. So at least it
Absolutely.
would be a
Indeed.
little bit more generalizable. So for these type of decisions, and studied in the consumer space, but also would apply to bigger decisions in industry.
Yeah,
Um, what if somebody does research on them and thinks they know, how are salespeople gonna get at it?
absolutely. Indeed.
I mean,
So, indeed. Sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead. I
Mm.
say I don't know if you want me to go into those yet, or I'll let
No,
you
that's
ask the
exactly right. That's
questions.
exactly. So essentially, that's what it is. So for me, that was what was very interesting because the moment we went to high involvement, most B2B purchases, because of the nature of the purchase, because of how big it is, how important it is, you could almost mimic your consumers who are looking at high involvement purchases the same. And that's what I like about this and the fact that it's generalizable. Yes,
Yeah,
sure, there are going to be conditions where the B2B sale is going to be different, but overall, I think the person making a decision is still a human being, and that's what I really like. So
yeah,
tell me about Hindi. So tell me about what
yeah.
were some of the key things that you were looking at when you
Yeah,
started
so
taking a look
kind
at
of
it. Yeah.
boiling this down, I mean, it was a bigger project originally, but boiling it down to what we just published recently was the idea of influence. I'm interested in interpersonal influence.
Mm,
I worked in sales for a number of years, and I just like the idea. Well, I guess I saw the good and the bad of being able to influence people, and you
mm,
can use it for good, you can use it for bad. You can get people to do things that, if you're good at it, you can get people to do things that they weren't planning to do.
yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting topic to me, just in general. So when we started investigating this topic, looked at the literature on how salespeople influence customers, and there's
Mm,
actually not a whole ton really,
Yeah.
on these influence tactics. There's different ways that salespeople can do it. And there's research that goes back into management. There's a lot of research on how managers and employees influence each
Yeah.
other and
Yeah.
coworkers influence each other. And then there's some that looks at how channel partners, so people in, distribution chains and, people selling to Walmart, whatever,
Yeah. Yeah.
that those people influence each other. And then in 2006, there's an article research by McFarland and some other co-authors that brought the idea of these influence tactics to the
Yeah.
sales world and adaptive selling. There's a paper that I have that's 2016 that looks at influence across different people and that salespeople work with, customers and internal teams and external partners. But for this one, we looked at these influence tactics, and we
Yeah.
took it from this McFarland research, and really going back to much older research than that, the idea that there's really three main mechanisms that drive interpersonal influence. And one of them is compliance, which is more of a pressure kind of thing. One of them is internalization, which is more of kind of an informational type of thing. And one of them is identification. I always get those mixed up, the I
Yeah.
one. There's two I's. I'm going to look and make sure I said it right. Yeah, identification as a sales influence tactic. And they're more granular than that. There's some tactics that underlie each one. But the one that for the identification is this idea of salespeople that become your friend. They like ingratiate themselves to you. They build rapport with you. They're likable, that kind of stuff. So there's three distinctly different things there. One, I'm just selling based on the facts. One, I'm selling based on pressuring you into buy something. And one of them, I'm selling you based on the fact that we like each other. We get along kind of, I'm selling you a vision of, your future self or something real kind of fluffy. So we looked at these and we identified that these were six. There's six of the tactics, but three of these, we've grouped them into three different mechanisms that underlie these theoretical mechanisms. And we looked at how when somebody has informed themselves, or we called the construct we came up with was called informedness.
Yeah.
A lot of people have trouble saying that. It's informedness is how I say it.
Yeah.
We found this construct in, or this idea of informedness, like in political science, it's talked about, in accounting, it's talked about, some public policy areas it's talked about, some e-commerce, people, this idea. So it's developing this idea of informedness. And what's interesting about informedness is we investigated this further is, sometimes you can be informed for a product and early on people would say, well, isn't that just an expert, or isn't that just somebody that is very involved with the product or something? Or don't they just have a lot of product knowledge? And the answer is yes, that could be, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
So Deba, have you ever felt you've become informed about some product?
For me, no. Well, some TV series, yes, but not necessarily a product. But yeah, if you consider a TV series as a service product, yes, but not necessarily an expert. And that's what I really like about the nuance between an expert and an informed.
Let me ask you this. I know when you moved to the United States, you were interested in buying a large television set.
Yes.
Now, do you consider yourself an expert on TVs?
No.
Were you informed when you made that purchase?
Not necessarily, but I did some homework, but I would never consider myself an expert.
No, but I said, were you informed?
I did some homework, but I just got me more confused.
So if I asked you when you walked in, say you walked into a store, I don't know how you purchased TV, but say you walked in a store and you're going to go purchase a TV and you'd done some research prior. You'd looked online, you've read some reviews, you had a general idea of what you wanted to buy, but you weren't 100% sure. On a scale of 1 to 7, what would you rank your informedness about that purchase only, not being an expert?
4.
A 4. Okay. So you're middle of the road. I mean, and people are at different levels. And maybe I'd ask you about a different purchasing situation and you'd say I was a 7. But you could be a 7 as an informedness, but you might be a 2 as an expert, right? So
Absolutely.
You could also be a 7 as an expert and a 7 with informedness. So there's a difference between them because we can be informed about things. In my classic example, and one of the reasons I even studied this topic was I purchased a pickup truck while I was working on this research, and I literally wasn't planning to buy one that day. I hadn't done any research. I just test drove a truck because we were getting a car in for service, and within about half an hour, maybe an hour over getting lunch and looking around on my phone and stuff, I went back and I would have said I was pretty informed because I did some research, but honestly, I hadn't thought about buying. I'd purchased cars in the past. I understood the idea, but I didn't know much about the marketplace. And within an hour, I wouldn't say I was an expert, but I'd say I was pretty informed about that purchase. So there's a difference that it's kind of the situational thing. It's what you walk into the store with or what you walk online. If you do it online, it doesn't involve salespeople that way, but it's the idea that you you can build up a certain amount of knowledge for this one instance, and a lot of that will dissipate. I think it goes well with the consumer journey as well, because it talks about you're
Absolutely.
always kind of learning some stuff, but every now and then you kind of have a peak of information and you're going to go do something about it, and then you're still kind of paying attention as time goes on, but once in a while you're more engaged than at other times. And I think informedness comes from that, where we have some sense of being an expert or not, and some sense of knowledge of the product or the product class or whatever, but at times we can make ourselves, and I mean, I've become informed about things I would have never thought I'd even buy. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you go to buy things you'll never buy again. I mean, I bought a chainsaw. I'm
Mhm.
not ever want to be an expert on, but I needed one, so I did a little. I was kind
Yeah.
of informed about that particular decision. I'm no expert. I couldn't tell you much about them today, right? So
But
then,
indeed,
yeah,
right?
go ahead.
Sorry to
Good
interrupt, because
talk.
I think what is really interesting here is that this also describes many B2B buying decisions, right?
Right, right,
And that is what I really like about this, because yes, you talk about consumers and people could say, is it really applicable to B2B? But that's what happens in most, even if you go with this numbers of 57% or 70% of them knowing it, they might inform themselves, but if they're not experts, and in B2B, it's more important for them to talk to a sales rep because I'm informed, but I just want to make sure that I inform myself with the right
right.
information.
Yeah, so the
So
salesperson almost becomes like I always call them like a filter, or they need to
absolutely,
be, and then this gets this idea of knowledge broker and stuff, but
yeah,
the salesperson, if they're doing their job well, will interact with the customer, the business buyer, in a way that is trusting enough, that is open enough, that they can get some sense of what this
absolutely.
buyer needs
Mhm.
and is doing, which
Mm.
has always been the case in sales. So I'm not saying that's new, but what's new is that the buyer also now thinks they're not like walking in saying, "Hey, let me tell you my problems and you give me a
Yeah,
solution." They're walking in and saying, "Hey, I've got the solution, let me buy it." And the salesperson saying, "Well, why don't you let me just run it through my computer a little bit, and I'm not going
yeah,
to try and sell anything. I just want to make sure you get the right product, because otherwise the satisfaction will be bad. You won't buy from me
absolutely.
again. You'll be mad at me and my company. You'll tell people bad things." Um, we don't want that as salespeople. So we want this opportunity. And often the answer is, and my research tells this, the answer is the customer's right. I mean, some people are just they've done the research well, and they know what they need, and they found the right solution, but that isn't always the case. So that's where I see
Indeed.
the salesperson as being that kind of that final step, having this broad knowledge of the situation better than most customers would, and being able to kind of assess and diagnose what the customer needs, and then deliver the right product to them in a way that they're happy
Very.
about. That they might be changing their mind, but they're happy about it.
Absolutely. And that's what I really like about what we're saying, because one of the things we always say is that a buyer should get a feeling that they're buying something rather than being sold something, right?
Right.
And based on what you're saying is that I may come in being informed, but if I'm not informed the right way, then a salesperson can then set my needs correct and then sell me the right solution so that I don't end up making a mistake.
Yeah.
Or if I am right, then they're going to act as a voice of reason, saying, hey, you know what, to reduce cognitive dissonance, that is the idea that, hey, did I make the right choice or not? They can just reassure you that you are making the right choice, and might actually, by just ingratiating themselves to you or whatever it is, by saying that, hey, you did the right choice, they are going to make the customer or the consumer, again, at this point in time, even though you say consumer, I'm just looking at the broad idea of human beings making decisions in
Right.
B2B, that you feel safe and you feel good about yourself, that you did the homework, and it was
Right.
kind of reaffirmed by the salesperson. And not to forget that in a kind of a B2B setting, it's even more important because a person buying may not be buying for themselves, they may be buying for somebody else.
Yeah.
So that kind of risk reduction as well.
Yeah, and I'm just going to build on that just slightly. In the course of conducting this research in my dissertation, which covers a couple of areas around this, not just what's in this paper, I was able to attend a conference of jewelry retailers.
Yeah.
Um, and again, a consumer setting, but I think it's the same. It's a high
Yeah.
cost product. There's a lot of implications to if you screw it up. Um, so I went to this thing and I was able to interview, I don't know, 20 of them or so, and it's actually in a book chapter, but um, and what was interesting and what I came away with was they said that a lot of the people that come in, a lot of their customers that come in that have this, what they would call high informedness, they're very convinced in their decision. And often they're very convinced in the dead wrong decision. They have incorrect or inaccurate or incomplete information, and they're going to buy something that the salesperson knows. They might even want to sell them a lower cost product because it's a better for what they're trying to do. and they're just not open to that. And
Yeah.
they said that's a real problem. Like they don't want to help people make wrong decisions. Anyways, I was able to talk to him, and it's really where this idea of, well, how do you influence them then? If that's,
Yeah.
what do you do with that? Um, and you mind if I just go into these results real
Sure.
quick? Because
Absolutely.
and it's real simple. I mean, it's not a complex thing. So there's these three different influence ways of doing stuff. And really we found two of the three aren't bad. One is good in one setting and bad in the other. So the idea of giving people more information, this internalization, giving them recommendations, exchanging information, going deep into things. There's some variation, and it's not as good in some settings as others. But for the lowest informed person, um, it's not as effective. As the informedness goes up for you as a 4, it would be fine if you did that as a salesperson. It wouldn't give you a great dramatic
Yeah.
increase. As it goes up even higher, it's a really good way for you to influence a customer that has high informedness. So they walk
Yeah.
in, and you're going to spend some time exchanging information with them, recommending things,
Yeah.
having this back and forth. If you can get the customer to do that, and they should be more open to that if they have higher informedness.
Yes. Yeah.
It has some good positive, and it's just across the board goes up if you
Yeah.
do that, but it's not dramatic. Like
Yeah.
it works pretty much in all settings. It just works better for the more informedness that there
Yeah.
is. Then there's the idea of this, kind of being their friend. I like to call it this
Yeah.
identification, this ingratiation, this inspirational
Yeah.
appeal. Can you see yourself in this,
Yeah.
new diamond ring or this car or whatever? Um, Again, in this case, the it has pretty much a positive effect across everybody, but the effects are greater for the very low informed
Yeah.
than the very
Yeah.
high. It's
Yeah.
not damaging for the very
Mm.
very high informed, but it's
The impact is much
better for the
better.
one that isn't, right? So the
Yeah.
person that comes in not knowing much, if you befriend them and they like you and you're all getting along well and they're seeing themselves with a kind of better state of being because they
Mm.
purchase something, it's going to have a better impact.
Mm.
But it's not necessarily going to drive away the
Mm.
the person that has some informedness either. So
Mm.
being a good rapport and stuff isn't a bad idea. It's
Yeah.
just not the best effective idea. The one that was really dramatic though was the compliance one, where,
Mm.
and that's not necessarily com- a co- it can be a coercive type thing, but it doesn't have to be. It can be, it's called promise or threat. So
Mm.
you might be threatening, and that sounds like a terrible word, but you might be threatening
Yeah.
that something's going to end, a special's going to go away, that
Yeah.
if you leave today and don't purchase, or if you don't order this thing by the end of the week, you're using some time element or some kind of pressure to
Yeah.
threaten somebody. Or you're saying, if you're promising something, well, if you do it today, I'll give you something. It's either a loss or a gain, but you're basing it on something not or happening or not happening
Mm.
that the customer desires, right? In that case, if you use that with the high informed consumer, it has dramatically negative effects.
Mm.
And if you use that with the low informed consumer, it has dramatically positive effects. So
Yeah.
here's where I think the interesting part of this research is. The other two are kind of like, okay, well, great, you can kind of figure that out. And this one, you might be able to figure it out. But what we found in this interaction with a mathematical statistical way is that for the low informed consumer, if somebody comes in and they aren't informed and I've gone into situations like this where I've said, I really haven't done my research. I
Mm.
really am just kind of relying on you. It's the more traditional customer. I've communicated that to salespeople because I know it's their job to do this. And I've said, can you help me? If they're offering me some kind of
Mm.
incentive or something to make me make a purchase, I would be more apt to buy if they did that.
Mm.
However, if I walked in and I said, I've done my homework and I've done my research and I have a pretty good idea of what I'm looking for, and they followed that same approach, I'd be very likely not to purchase.
Yeah.
So it's pretty important to figure out, and that's kind of the idea of adaptive selling. It's pretty important for the salesperson to determine what their customer is. And I don't think any of this is super new. It's just that we found that these dramatic differences between high and low informedness, which hadn't been
Indeed.
studied before. Of course, we know we need to adapt to customers. Of course, we
Yeah.
need to know what they're buying on and their criteria. But if we know that somebody has done, especially in a consumer setting where we tested it, but also in a B2B setting, if we know that the customer has done their homework and we've spent some time figuring out if their informedness is correct, and if they have selected the right product, we should just try and, through information exchange and
Yeah.
recommendation, we should then just sell them the product. But if we've found out that they need something different, we should try and influence them that way through some good information exchange and recommendation. But if we try and use these tactics to pressure somebody that's informed, were literally going to drive them away. And we did have, I mean, the data we used for this research was based on actual shoppers of cars that had actually purchased or not purchased a
Yeah.
vehicle. So it was not to get deep into it, but it was, they either did or they didn't buy. And
Yeah.
why did they either did or didn't buy is kind of the point, right? So I think it's kind of interesting, and it's definitely applicable to the B2B. I mean, I mentioned this to you on a different topic before this, but I was recently at a company, and they're actually a B2B company working with medical offices,
Huh?
so B2B buyers, and they are literally using the consumer personas
Yes, indeed.
of the person they're talking to. So if I were from this company and you were my client, I would be, well, let's see, David looks like he's, middle-aged, and
Yeah.
he lives in the Midwest, and, he has a wife and kids. And from that, I can start building a persona for you of things that you might be interested in, how I might present my message to you. So they're using this stuff about Deva, the person, but I might be selling you some industrial machine. I'm using this to get your interest and gain your confidence and build trust with you. And then later, ultimately, you're going to be a professional buyer, and
Yeah.
you're going to be talking to me about things that are important to your business and the value outcomes and things you need. But for me to be the sales rep that's sitting in your office in that final discussion, they're using buyer personas of the consumer to build to that point, right? So I think that's
Absolutely.
very interesting, that the way that there's this kind of crossover between pretty much buyers. I mean, buyers are people, right?
Yeah.
I think the application maybe gets a little weaker maybe when you get to a really regulated buying center kind of situation that's a very strict procurement
No,
process
indeed.
and things. It may not exactly as generalized, but in most cases, and I tell you, in all the selling I did in B2B, the people were at least initially buying on personal things. Like they were thinking about things as
Uh,
people first, and then later we would get around to the idea of
Absolutely.
how does this affect my business. But I
Indeed.
mean, for me to get in the door, I needed to catch their attention with things that are interested to them. So
Yeah.
um, anyhow.
No, but for me is that the more I take a look at this, and I think the fact is that your study for me, first of all, is very interesting because from our domain, we've always talked about the fact that salespeople need to be adaptive. But the question is that adaptiveness has been based on the kind of person sitting in front of them, their social profiles, or the way they interact and everything around your social style, emotional intelligence, and stuff like that. But it does not take into account typically, at least from my knowledge, about how informed the customer is. And that is what I think is the novelty of the study, which you did focus on consumers, but which, as you correctly said, in my opinion, B2B buyers happen to be individuals who still have, as individuals, as consumers, they make certain decisions. I think the findings from yours are, from a commercial organization's perspective, very interesting because, as you said, I'm not surprised that companies are now looking at buyer personas and using marketing techniques to come up with kind of arguments that can be used to even inform the customers
Right.
first. And then once you have that, then the salespeople then are also given the same kind of using, if you have this kind of persona, what is the best possible way to have a conversation with
it,
them?
it's pretty amazing. I mean, from what
Yeah,
I understand from this company is it starts with inbound marketing, and they
yeah,
they have
exactly.
people coming in answering after
Yeah,
webinars and all that kind of demand generation stuff, and these people are coming to their websites to do the initial connection.
yeah,
Eventually we'll talk to a salesperson, but as they're filling out the basic
indeed,
simple information, and based on geography of where they're I mean, the companies know all this stuff, right? Based on all kinds of stuff they can glean in the very beginning of, before they even really know the person, like they're just typing in their name and their address and
indeed,
a couple other little items, and they're getting other information by factoring in other data that's
indeed,
out there in the world, right, on this person. Before they even ever talk to a salesperson, there's AI that is out there that is
indeed,
developing a
indeed.
message that, so literally as you fill out that form, the next screen you go to for each of us would be different, because you would get a different screen than I would based on my buyer
Absolutely.
persona.
Yeah,
So you're getting the same probably information, but presented differently, or maybe different key features that would be better suited to me versus you. And they're gaining that interest and taking the customer through this funnel
yeah,
that ultimately leads them to to a salesperson that then really gets down to the business of the selling them the business product. But you got to get them to that point first, and there's a lot of people
absolutely.
out there that are competing with you. So
Indeed.
most of my research, I was thinking most of this research would is geared towards the new client, but because in B2C, I make the argument in this research that there's really not a lot of history. I mean, there's not a, there might be, you might have bought a car from here 3 years ago, but you're not having a day-to-day, week-to-week kind of relationship, right, with your car salesperson, and you might have no relationship. And the stuff I'm talking about, buyer personas, is getting them in the funnel. But then these things can be used throughout too.
Indeed.
I mean, I don't think it has to end there. I mean, it's you would use them differently as you go, but you would even have a more fine-tuned model of when to use which techniques versus others.
And this is my takeaway from this is the fact is that, yes, your study focused on the salesperson and that, but the way things are going in the world of marketing and sales, there's going to be a joint marketing and sales impact that you have there. If you could call marketing doing some of the job that salespeople would do and try to do that initial level of gauging whether that person is informed or not. And then the salespeople will then come in and say, depending upon the level of informedness that they can gauge based on these marketing driven personas and everything else, they can adapt their tone and the way, not just the tone, but the kind of the influenced approaches or the influence tactics that they use towards saying, hey, if you happen to be low informed, and hey, maybe I can talk to you about what will happen if you do not necessarily buy this now, that you might lose out on something. That might be a much better influencing tactic there, rather than if you find that, hey, through all the research, through all the things that you've done already, if the buyer seems to be pretty informed, then you need to give much more about, hey, here is some more information that will just help you make your decision faster. And that pretty much is where I'm taking in my head well-structured sales and marketing organizations, that the learnings from this is marketing helping salespeople also deal with these kind of pre-gauging whether a person that they're talking to, because of all this inbound marketing and everything else, can then hand it over to sales to make the sales process a lot more effective. And I think that's pretty much where I really
I think it's getting harder and harder to, not always, but in a lot of cases, what marketing can do much more fine-grained than they used to be able to do because of data and information. What they can do almost looks like a sales like it's almost that, like it's almost that adaptive, right? So but there's still eventually in many cases needs to be a salesperson too.
Absolutely.
Takes it the final mile, right? That really fine-tunes it. So I think it's getting harder and harder to differentiate that. Not in all cases. I mean, there's still mass marketing and all kinds of stuff that we do in marketing, but in a lot of cases, I'm like, yeah, it's pretty hard. Why wouldn't you just call this marketing? I mean, or I don't know. I mean, it's kind of interesting how we're using data. But I will tell you one great thing that came from this research is I did this dissertation on empowered consumers and selling to them and knowledge broker salespeople, and then some guy I never met before had a conference he was hosting in Europe that was called Selling to the Empowered Consumer. And I said, I was just finishing my doctoral program. I said, I got to go to this. It's like almost exactly the title of my dissertation. I need to go. So that's where I met you, Deva.
Indeed.
Since then, we finally published a paper together. So we're co-authors now.
Indeed.
And it's been just interesting working with you and all the
absolutely. And I think I think that's really cool. Indeed.
It was over this topic, literally. I mean, I may have met you again, but I mean, I literally came to that conference only because of the name of the topic. So that was it.
Indeed. And by the way, this is a paper that is co-authored with Willie Bolander from Florida State University. I believe there is also Ronald Goldsmith, who's now at Florida State University, as well as Christopher Plouffe, who's now at New Mexico State University.
Yeah. So Willie Bolander and Ron Goldsmith is retired emeritus at Florida State, and then Chris Plouffe at New Mexico State. Yep.
Well, Bryan, thank you so much for taking your time to share.
Well, I'll just give you a little teaser. There's a follow-up piece to this that's in the review, has an R&R at the Journal of Retailing right now. So I may have some more insights for you in the future, but
that's going to be part two of this chronicle that we're talking about.
There you go. Might be a little while though. Well. So, all right. Thank you.
Thanks. And again, stay tuned for the next edition of the Sales Academic Chronicles here at the Center for Professional Selling at Ball State University. Thank you again.